Welcome, everybody, to the Fund the People podcast and another installment of our Defend Nonprofits, Defend Democracy series. In this series on defending nonprofits and defending democracy, we report on the Trump administration's war on charity, the war on nonprofits and philanthropy and civic culture. And we share empowering examples and opportunities of funders, nonprofits, and intermediaries speaking out, taking action, and making things better as much as possible. Today is actually the second episode we're doing with folks from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, sometimes referred to as RWJ. And RWJ was, I think, the first, or at least one of the first major national independent foundations to speak out against some of the harmful policies of this second Trump administration with regard to public health, healthcare, and the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. So we're very thankful to the folks at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for setting that path for the rest of us. And we'll link to our other episode, which focuses on investing in nonprofits that are advocating to sustain and develop effective public policy and private institutional policy on racial justice and racial equity. Today, we're going to be talking about something that may get less discussion and less focus in the field, but is a really, really interesting lane in terms of defending our democracy and the role of nonprofits and philanthropy. In doing so, we're going to be talking about defending citizen access to ballot initiatives, really defending our ability to directly vote on policies at the local level, rather than just voting on elected officials who then vote on policies. So really important conversation. I know I'm going to learn a lot, and I think you will as well. Our guest today is Liz DiLauro, who serves as Senior Policy Officer with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where she shapes strategy and grant making at the state level to advance long-term change in the social policies that impact our nation's health and well-being. Liz, welcome to the Fund the People podcast.
Thanks so much, Rusty. I'm really excited to be here this morning.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to have you. As you could hear from my intro, I think this is going to be an important conversation and one that I certainly haven't had before on this podcast or really elsewhere. And I don't think a lot of people are talking about. So I'm glad you're getting out there to discuss your work. So let's get into it. You've been working in foundation philanthropy for 4 years now. And so I've been adjacent to the foundation community for a while. And I was curious how, as a newer philanthropoid, how do you perceive things have changed in those 4 years, the conversations among funders sort of before the election and since the election? I think people would be interested to hear your perceptions on that, if you're willing to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been in the philanthropy world for about 4 years after doing advocacy and organizing for about 2 decades. And so I'm not sure when my newbie card to philanthropy is going to expire. I definitely still feel new pretty often, but I think that a lot of folks have reinforced that this moment that we're in, this sort of political reality, sits inside a predictable historical pattern. Our CEO, Dr. Rich Besser, often talks about how every major period of progress in our country has then triggered backlash, and that today's attacks that we're seeing on nonprofits and democratic access fit within that historical pattern. At the same time, I think that we're at a particular flashpoint right now in how we are experiencing democratic backsliding. It's happening federally, as we've already talked about. It's happening in states. It's happening in local governments. Our systems have and continue to be manipulated so that people's voices and their votes are losing their power. And we're seeing large-scale executive overreach from the administration, but also from governors, which we've been seeing in some states for several years now, even preceding this administration. Our state governments are hyper polarized. I think it's 39 states are under single party control across executive and legislative branches. And so that party then controls the policy issues that are on the agenda, regardless of the opinion of voters. Congressional districts are gerrymandered to keep that power in the control of a single party. And as we'll talk about today, say, at the same time that this is all happening, politicians are also rewriting the rules of the ballot measure process as a way of removing what is sometimes the only pathway for people to have a voice on the issues that really matter to them. So yes, I think what we're seeing is part of a historical pattern, but the house is also on fire, right? And I think the ecosystem really has to act like it. And so I'm heartened that RWJF has been speaking out against the policies from the administration that threaten health and well-being. Like, it's clearly not about politics. It's about health. It's about safety. It's about democracy and the promise of that. And so I do think that the conversation with funders has shifted a bit. I think we're seeing more and more philanthropic partners sort of engaging in democracy things and thinking about prioritizing democracy defense as part of their work, even if they're not traditional democracy funders. And I think that this is a recognition of the fact that defending democracy right now makes all of the other goals possible, right? It doesn't matter what your social justice mission is. If there aren't democratic processes to advance the issues that we care about, then those missions are in jeopardy.
Well said. Yeah. For those funders listening who are still waiting to see what's going to happen or what they should do, there are lots of examples out there of funders responding proactively, and they're probably in your community. So today we're going to talk about one, and I think RWJF is a great example of not being fearful of speaking out for values and missions. And as you said, it's not about partisanship or even about politics, although everything is political. But there's a difference between partisanship and politics, and policy shaped by politics. So, folks, we have to engage. We can't ignore this. We can't just focus on individual cuts to particular grantees. There's a whole ecosystem of policy and propaganda and executive action happening, and funders can take action within the legal boundaries and moral boundaries that are set forth in the law. So I just encourage folks not to remain dormant if they are. Okay, so tell us, what are ballot initiatives and why are they so important to democracy and the nonprofit sector?
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited to just nerd out a little bit on this. So in 24 states, voters have access to the ballot initiative process, and that's also called direct democracy. You'll hear it called the citizen initiative process, the initiative petition process. It kind of depends exactly what and where you are. But really what it is a process to allow voters to propose new policies and vote on them directly at the ballot box. These can be changes in state law, so statutory changes, but they can also be state constitutional amendments as well, sort of depending on the size and the scope of the change. And in the last decade or so, ballot measures have really been critical ways that policies that advance health and racial equity have made progress. So on issues like Medicaid expansion, minimum wage increases, paid leave, protection of reproductive rights. These are all policies that are by and large popular with voters across the aisle, on both sides of the aisle, and that the nonprofit sector is deeply invested in advancing, right?
Not all of the sector, but,
not all of the
there's
sector,
a lot of diversity.
Yes, a lot of diversity. And I think we've seen time and time again how ballot measures can be transformative for people's health and well-being. And a study that we often cite is from like a health affairs brief from last year that really showed that. I think it was over the last 10 years or so that more than 60% of ballot measures that passed were related to health. And so there's a clear connection between ballot measures and health and well-being. And with state legislatures as hyper-polarized as they are, ballot measures give people a way to signal what matters to them, right? And to take action directly, even when their representatives aren't moving on those issues or aren't motivated to move on those issues. And I think a criticism sometimes is that ballot measures can be seen as sort of a workaround to government, like a workaround to representative democracy. But we really see it as a complementary mechanism that strengthens the democratic ecosystem and really helps people build trust in government and build their own civic power. And so we see them as complementary. And I think when access to democratic tools like the ballot measure process are weakened, as we're seeing right now, it has a cascading effect on policy outcomes across a lot of different issues. And then essentially the supports and the protections that people rely on, like healthcare, like paid leave to take care of a sick family member, like a livable wage. And as I think about the nonprofit workforce and the role of nonprofits, we're all operating within this environment, right? It's all the same environment, it's all the same water. And I think often nonprofits are the organizations that are responsible for trying to improve these policies and these conditions as well for people. And so there's just clear connections there.
You mentioned some policies that might be heard as, liberal agenda items, but a ballot initiative can be used by any group to advance their values or policy agenda, right? It's not any particular ideology that benefits from having these, right? It's everybody, if they go through the process, can participate in putting forth these and voting on them, right?
100%. Yep. Ballot measures are a democratic process, right? And there are ballot measures that are pending this year that I think folks could argue both would advance health equity and others that would really damage it as well. And so, at the core of this is also that people, their voices should matter. Their votes should matter. And being able to directly shape the policies that impact you is critical to a healthy democracy.
Yeah, exactly. If we're in a marketplace of competing ideas, right? Why shouldn't we all have the right to put those ideas out there to the test of our peers and fellow citizens and see how it shakes out? I think direct democracy should be something the people on the right and left and in the center all agree is a positive thing for our society. I was curious to hear how you mentioned that access to ballot initiatives is being restricted, or there are attempts to restrict it. What does that look like? What's been happening with that? And who is that? Governors doing that, state assemblies and senates, or who is trying to do that? And what does that look like?
So in sort of the wake of policy wins on a lot of the issues that I've mentioned and that we've talked about, legislatures and then the governor, to when they'll sign the bill in several states, are now trying to change the rules of the ballot measure process to make it harder, more complicated, riskier for people to use. And there's no surprise it's happening in states where progress toward equity is being made on the ballot. And the attacks on the process look a variety of different ways, like some that feel small, others that feel really big. And there are things like increasing the number of signatures needed to put something onto the ballot, or changing like the different districts and how things are counted and how something gets onto a ballot, raising the threshold for a ballot measure to pass beyond a simple majority. So trying to move the threshold for passage from 50% to 60%, something that Florida has done several years ago. And actually, when their most recent ballot campaign to protect abortion was voted on, they got 57% of the vote, but it did not pass in Florida because their threshold is 60. It would have passed in pretty much any other state that has ballot initiatives. Things like requiring a ballot measure to pass multiple times before it's enacted.
Really?
And making the process to gather signatures just harder. So just an example of that, new laws were passed last year in Florida and Arkansas that made canvassing mistakes now sort of open to criminal charges. And so for folks who are gathering signatures in their community, in their church, their community center, to get something onto the ballot, mistakes, like honest mistakes, can now lead to criminal charges, which is a little bonkers to think about. And like, what a deterrent to people trying to exercise their democratic rights and to engage in their communities around the things that matter to them. So people in the states where these attacks are happening are losing access to the opportunity to use ballot measures to advance things that they care about. And so in 2023, so about 3 years ago, RWJF identified protecting access to the ballot process as a priority for us, really sort of recognizing the critical role that it plays in policies that we care about that advance health equity, being able to make progress. And so between when we started and this year's grant cycle, we've invested approximately $15 million in organizations who are working to defend against attacks on direct democracy, both nationally and then in the states where the attacks are happening too.
Are there websites or other resources where listeners could go to find out about ballot initiative access in their state? Like, do they have it in their state, and how does it work? Like, are there clearinghouses or some of your grantees that kind of house that info that folks could look at?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So I would direct people to the website for the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center and the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center Foundation, which is their C3 arm and our grantee. They have a ballot measure tracker that not only looks at all the states and what actual ballot measures are pending on particular issues, like across a lot of different things, it also has a section on the attacks that are happening and the threats to the process itself. And I'd also just highlight a recent report that they put out that we should definitely share with your listeners that really takes a look back at the different types of attacks that are happening and sort of pulls out some trends that have been happening too. So that's a great resource for folks.
That's fantastic. Yeah, we'll definitely get those links from you and put them in the show notes. And do you want to share any examples of what that grant making looks like, how you're structuring it, who are some of the other grantees, or what are the other types of grants you've made? Would love to just get a little more flavor of what this looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll also just start with my required legal disclaimer that RWJF is a 501c3 private foundation. And so legally, we are not allowed to support or endorse any actual ballot measure or ballot campaign. And so our priority is really around protecting access to the ballot measure process itself, as opposed to any particular measure or campaign. And so as we've tried to sort of within those bounds, really think about how RWJF can make an impact in this space, we've been sort of focusing on four main things. The first is to invest in the field. So invest in both the national partners like the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center Foundation and the Fairness Project Education Fund, who are monitoring what's happening, researching, and supporting partners as they defend against attacks on direct democracy. In addition to those national partners, we are supporting our advocacy and organizing partners in 6 different states now who are facing threats to direct democracy. And so that's Arkansas, Idaho, Mississippi, Missouri, North Dakota, and Utah. I think I got them all. And that work it's amazing. The organizations that we are supporting in those states, largely through flexible funding, they're kind of doing it all, right? They use the ballot process as ways to advance things that their constituents and folks in their communities care about. And they're also oftentimes one of the only ones who are there to protect the process itself now that it's under threat. And so they are doing democracy work. They're doing organizing on particular issues. And more, they're doing legal and litigation work as part of this too. And so anytime I get to talk about them is a good day because they're doing awesome work. Another part of our strategy is really looking at how we can help to build the public understanding of how access to ballot measures connects to health and well-being. And so doing this podcast, right, and doing different sort of communication strategies to really lift that up into the ecosphere, right, and really help to make that connection, because I don't think a lot of people necessarily do make the connection between ballot measures and health. We are also doing some work with the New America Foundation around how to sort of proactively expand access in more states. So not just playing defense in the states where there currently is a process that's under threat, but are there opportunities, and this is work that's underway with them, to expand the process where it doesn't exist. And then I think the last thing I'd say about sort of what our work in this area looks like, and this isn't on the grant making side, but we've really been trying to focus on how to engage peer funders in this work by sharing insights on sort of why protecting ballot measures is central to any mission that involves health or justice, and how private foundations can engage in it, because a lot of private foundations hear the word ballot and then they just completely back away because of the legal parameters around it. But we have really found not risky ways to do this work, right? That really is supporting the ecosystem of partners who are able to engage in it.
Wow, that's a lot of layers of work. And it's really interesting and important that you're doing all of them at the same time, or supporting and engaging with all of those strategies at once. Really interesting. You mentioned the legal restrictions on private foundations and all 501c3s. Can you just share a little bit, both for the funders listening and the operating nonprofits that fundraise? What should they be thinking about each of those audiences, or what do they need to know in terms of getting involved with ballot measures? And are there resources that you could point folks to on that front?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll start with 501c3 private foundations on the funder side.
Okay.
Folks like RWJF and a lot of other foundations where we are prohibited from lobbying and we can't support or endorse any kind of ballot measure.
Prohibited from lobbying except in defense of philanthropy,
Ourselves.
right?
Yes, true,
Yeah.
true. Good catch. And so for private foundations, one of the ways that as we've done this work over the past few years that we've really found that we can add value into the ecosystem where lobbying is needed, right? Ballot measures are lobbying campaigns, like they just are. So despite the fact that we can't support those or talk about them really if they're active, there's so much that we can do. And so our approach has been to really look at how we can support the infrastructure of partners who are doing this work. So well before ballot measures are active and moving, these are our 501c3s that are working on a lot of different issues, and we can fund their infrastructure. So we largely support them through general operating support to support their overall sustainability and their operations. One of the other things that we have learned is that the earlier that private foundations can do this for groups that often are working on multiple issues like this, the earlier that we can fund, the better, because then we're helping to support their sort of overall operations and program. And then as they move into running campaigns and things that they can do with their own sort of legal parameters, they can free up other resources to do that more targeted work. And the early C3 money from private foundations can provide their organization just some backbone.
Mm-hmm. And when you say the earlier the better, ballot initiatives could be on the 4-year presidential cycle or midterms or off year, right? It could be any of those.
They can be anytime. They tend to be heavier when there are bigger elections. And so if you look at a particular state and the timing of things, trying to make sure that the private foundations are investing as early as possible. We've heard over and over again from partners has been really key to helping them do what they need to do. And so I also, before I talk a little bit about what the public charities can do, I also just want to put out the offer to listeners, particularly funder listeners, that we have learned a lot of lessons in this work, and we are always looking to be able to share them and to connect with folks and talk about how to do it. And so put that offer out there. So that's sort of the private foundation part of C3s. So the public charity part of C3s, unlike private foundations like RWJF, they can support or oppose ballot measures, including working to get measures onto a ballot. And so doing so is lobbying. But public charities can lobby, right? They're subject to their own lobbying limits, of course, and if they have funding that allows them to do so. But this is work that they can do. Things like voter education and nonpartisan public information about ballot campaigns. They can build coalitions. They can organize grassroots support, so much that they can do. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say, as they're doing this work, they need to follow both federal law, of course, but then also state law, because particularly with ballot measure work, that is often regulated in states through state campaign finance laws, in addition to lobbying laws. And so compliance does get more complicated, but there are great organizations out there, like you said, that really help to navigate a lot of this. So groups like the Alliance for Justice have great resources for nonprofits as they're navigating compliance around ballot work. And then I would say that organizations like the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center and the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center Foundation that I mentioned earlier also support partners as they're doing this work as well.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get the Boulder advocacy folks, which is part of the Alliance for Justice, to come on the show, because they're just awesome. I've listened to their podcast. I think it's called The Rules of the Road, which I recommend as well. Bunch of lawyers who want to help nonprofits engage in civic policy work within the bounds and the word and spirit of the law. Thank you for sharing both of those It is interesting that private foundations can't lobby except in self-defense. And I guess if you fund lobbying efforts, it counts as you lobbying as a funder, right? So that's why you can't do that. But you can give other forms of support for the organization that is not specifically about any kind of electoral related work or ballot work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So we often will support partners who are largely C3 public charities with general operating support in this space.
Right. And then I don't know if this is relevant at all, but there is that campaign All In by April, which is, I think, about encouraging funders to do their nonpartisan civic participation funding by April of each electoral cycle, so that, as you said, putting the money in earlier is helpful, because there is this tendency to be late funders, to be kind of funding this stuff at the last minute and be too slow. And then the nonprofits have to do the work and get paid later. And that is very difficult. So we don't want to be those kind of funders, right?
Exactly, right. And in the space around protecting ballots, oftentimes funders aren't engaging until it's a real issue, right? Like something has passed the legislature and now it's going to go to a vote of the people to change the ballot process. And at that point, they are ballot campaigns. And so C3 money, we can't support that. The later that it is, the more complicated it gets for the grantee to try to figure out where they need funding and how to structure all of that. And the last thing that we want to be doing while they are running campaigns is complicating things from the funder side, like adding more red tape and compliance. And so, yes, so the All In by April campaign is great. And yes, very in line with how we're thinking about this.
Yeah. And to your earlier point about those state groups you were mentioning in the 6 states, that they are doing issue work, often multi-issue work, plus they're doing defend democracy work now, plus they're doing that legislative and judicial work if needed, plus they're defending themselves as an institution, and they're dealing with funders who are scared, private philanthropic funders who are intimidated by the policy environment. So there's enough on the plates of nonprofits right now, and they need all the support they can get to stave off burnout and sustain their payroll and their team, and optimally build their team up to play these multiple roles in sort of bolstering our democracy. So I was curious in our last few minutes here, and you've alluded to all of this about how these democracy issues and direct democracy are connected to health. But I was curious to hear more about why and how the foundation has used its voice during this last year and a half. And I know some of the stuff preceded this administration, some of these approaches around racial justice and ballot access. What has speaking out and taking action looked like at the 500-foot level at RWJF?
Yeah. Our CEO, Dr. Besser, mentioned in a really recent letter to the field that philanthropy cannot stay neutral right now when democratic access is being threatened, because preserving democracy, as we've talked about a few times today, like it is core to being able to protect health and equity. It's core to our missions being able to be realized. And it's not separate from the nonprofit sector, right? It's part of creating the conditions that allow nonprofits and their workforce to do their jobs and to work toward the social changes that people and communities want and need. And so we've heard from grantees over the last 18 months or so that having funders use their voices is like absolutely critical right now. In addition to the resources that we're providing, they need the resources too, and they need more of them. But our voices are critical and they need more of us to do it. And so I think funders can use our institutions to provide grantees cover, right? And flank when they need it. We can amplify what they're doing and honestly, like just have their back in this sort of huge fight that we're all in. And so RWJF has been doing this through public statements, through coordination with other funders to defend the sector, comments on proposed federal regulations that are coming out, which is not a new thing for the foundation. It's something we've always done, but have been really doing that a lot recently, doing earned media around what's happening and more. Like there are so many different ways and so many different platforms that foundations have access to that we can be sort of creating the surround sound of this. And of course, we face risks when doing this, but it's not nearly the same level of risk that our grantees do, right? And so we can and we should be taking those risks. And I'm proud that RWJF is doing that. And as I think about this work particular to the ballot measure process, one of the ways that we have been trying to do this is when our partners in states think it's helpful, right? Because a national voice like RWJF isn't always helpful, right? In states that are seeing these threats. But when it is, like we can serve as like an external validator of the importance of the ballot measure process and how it connects and improves people's health. And so that's something that we have done when our grantees are saying that's a helpful piece of their strategy too.
That's awesome. I can attest to the validation factor, not even in policy, just as in an organization, is massive. You could get $1 from RWJF or another big name institution, well regarded, and that matters because they're a sponsor or a supporter. It doesn't matter how much or what kind of funding you're getting from them. So thank you for sharing that. Are there any words of encouragement or advice you want to leave our listeners with?
Sure. I think that the attacks that we're seeing on the ballot process, the nonprofit sector, democracy as a whole, they're cut from the same cloth. They're meant to concentrate power in the hands of a few and restrict the ability for people to have a direct say in the decisions that impact them. And I think the good and the bad news is that nonprofits, funders, advocates are not in this alone. Like we're doing it together, but it really takes everybody. Like it's no one funder, no one organization, like no one issue can take this on. It really has to be collective action. And I think there is increased alignment across the sector on this than I think we've seen before. And so I think that is encouraging. And I think speaking directly to funders, we have a responsibility, no matter the mission that we have or the issues that we care about, to use our power and our networks and our resources to support partners who are defending democracy in this moment. And so I think my encouragement is to stay visible, to stay grounded in what our partners and our advocates and our organizers are sharing with us. Trust in the vision that they have and the wisdom and the strategy that they're laying out to get there.
Thank you. Where can folks connect or learn more about Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and you, if you want to share any?
You can learn more about the foundation on our website, rwjf.org. I mentioned a recent letter to the field that we just put out, which I think is a great way to learn about both the work of our grantees and also sort of the direction of the foundation right now. And so we'll make sure that we share that with your listeners. And then I am on LinkedIn. If you want to connect with me, I'd be happy to. So my profile is under Elizabeth DiLauro.
Great. Well, really appreciate you joining us today and sharing your work and encouraging others to get involved in defending nonprofits and defending democracy through strengthening and defending access to the ballot initiative in the states and all these other ways that we've talked about today. So Liz DiLauro, thank you so much for coming on Fund the People podcast today.
It's been fun, Rusty. Thank you so much for having me.
And I think today, as we talk about health, it brings a new dimension to the way I usually sign off from the show, to keep your tank full, take care of yourself, and take care of one another.
How about that? Thank you.